Yeah, sure, sure. So, good morning and good afternoon and good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 2025 Prime Students COP30 program. So, I'm Bassel Daridi. I'm the Prime Students Regional Leader for Africa. And it's my pleasure to welcome you. This initiative brings together over 1,300 youth leaders from 101 countries, all united in their passion for climate action. So our today's session focuses on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, so carbon markets and international cooperation, which is a key pillar for global climate action, enabling countries to collaborate and achieve their climate targets in an effective and equitable way. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Ng Johnston, a research fellow in net zero offsetting at the University of Oxford's Environmental Change Institute. Dr. Ng brings a wealth of knowledge on carbon markets and climate governance. So please, Dr. Ng, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Basil and Christina, for the invitation to take part in such an exciting program. And it really is fantastic to see all the different places in the world that people are joining from. And I think that really speaks to, again, one of the topics of today, which is international cooperation. Now, before I begin, it's worth saying that Article 6 is one of the most technical parts of the Paris Agreement. It was the part of the Paris Agreement that took the longest to agree. And so throughout today, I'll be presenting not just on Article 6, but a bit of background in terms of how carbon markets function and operate. Because really, to understand the potential opportunities as well as risks that Article 6 carries, it's really important to unpack the different forms of carbon markets and what they mean. And again, from that basis, how Article 6 may set to transform that. So, by way of introduction, we'll just run through the agenda. So, I'll be speaking for just over an hour. There will be some chances to chime in to share your thoughts on some topics, but we, of course, will then enjoy some reflections from a participant, and then we'll move to our Q&A section. So there's plenty to get through in these few hours. And again, it's worth saying that while Article 6 can be complex, the kinds of concepts that we'll be walking through really do play out across many different parts of the Paris Agreement and indeed negotiation streams at COP. So really, one of the key questions is how we turn kind of, hopes and prospects for climate mitigation into reality, and how do we ensure all the checks and balances exist to ensure that that financing is reaching where it needs to go and being used in a responsible way. So as by way of an agenda, we'll kick off with some carbon market fundamentals. As I said, Article 6 is a complex part of the Paris Agreement, but really does build off a lot of context and learnings from the broader carbon market. We'll then introduce environmental integrity as well as the need for net zero alignment. So this is critical because you can have a carbon market, but whether or not that carbon market brings us closer to or further from achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement is a really fundamental question. With the basis of what carbon markets are and what different concepts related to them mean, we'll then explore the evolution of carbon pricing within the United Nations. This includes going back to the Kyoto Protocol, which was the precursor to the Paris Agreement and included aspects of carbon trading. And we'll then unpack Article 6 and we'll see the ways in which it has built on the Kyoto Protocol and important ways that it has sought to do things differently. And one of those key concepts that it has sought to introduce is environmental integrity. So that's why we're kind of unpacking that before we turn to Article 6 and its innovations. We'll then critically examine to what extent is Article 6 a new dawn of international carbon markets. So we'll look at the latest practice that has emerged. And now be told that you guys are coming from a range of different backgrounds and stages in your studies. And what's really exciting about learning about Article 6 at this stage is we're very early in its operationalization. And so what we know is that new practitioners and students can know just as much about the new and emerging prospects of Article 6 as a professor of many decades, because it is brand new. And so to learn about it now, if it is a topic that interests you, it's a really great opportunity to extend that further in your studies and also by way of practice. We'll then also consider one part of the broader Paris Agreement or kind of UN climate regime right now, which is fast emerging. And this is applications to the aviation and maritime sectors. So formally, these are not part of the Paris Agreement, but critically, they often come up in relation to international carbon market discussions, including at the Paris Agreement level, because we do have some intersections. So we have an intersection, for instance, with the need for what's called a corresponding adjustment, and we'll come to that. We'll then conclude, and of course, there'll be opportunity for Q&A at the end. So before we kick off, I thought it would be nice to just poll the room and see what comes to mind when you think of carbon markets, because it's really important that we unpack the concept a little bit further and kind of really see where the kind of room is in terms of thoughts on this as a topic. So to provide your thoughts, you can either scan the QR code on your phone or head over to slido.com and put in that number 2161137. And if you have any issues doing that, also feel free to utilize the chat. And we'll give everyone a few moments to pop over there. Great, can see some people typing. Excellent, so we have sustainability. And interestingly, that's again one of these new innovations in Article 6 that we didn't see under the Kyoto Protocol. And in fact, while Article 6.4 is called the Paris Agreement Crediting Mechanism, in fact, it was also rumored to be called the Sustainable Development Mechanism for quite a while. And so, we can see that sustainability really does come into it. We can see issues related to reducing emissions and carbon credits, carbon taxes. This is all the right kinds of things to be thinking about, because as we'll unpack, there are different forms of carbon markets. They trade in different units, and really understanding the variety of different units that exist, how the different systems that generate these units intersect is critical for understanding both the role in achieving the Paris Agreement, but equally the role in guaranteeing concepts such as environmental integrity. We can also start to see concerns over greenwashing. And greenwashing is again one of these reasons why issues such as environmental integrity have become so key. But what's nice to see is we also see some examples of different types of projects. So we can see things related to trees, for instance, as well as greenhouse gases. We can see renewable energy. These are all different forms of projects that can generate carbon credits. We can also see this notion here of cost effectiveness. And this is critical as we'll unpack about understanding the very notions of where the thought to develop a carbon market system came about, and this focus on it being efficient to undertake mitigation elsewhere in certain circumstances. But we'll also unpack a little bit about concerns as to how to ensure that integrity, and again, also the considerations related to use. This is all great, so we'll give everyone another few minutes to add in their thoughts. You can see some things in the chat too about responsibility to ensure that carbon is emitted responsibly. So we can also already start to appreciate that as much as carbon markets are a tool to finance mitigation, there's a real question as well about who is financing that mitigation. And again, coming back to the overall theme of today's lecture, that international cooperation piece and what it means is really key to unpack not only the role of Article 6 within the Paris Agreement, but really the broader architecture of carbon markets that we have today, and in particular, the ways in which it's evolving into the future. Excellent. So we'll give everyone another few moments, and what we'll do is also you'll get a copy of these slides. So if it's too much to read right now, you're very welcome to head back to the slide afterwards and really unpack what it is your cohort has put up here, so which is great to see. Excellent. Can see some reference to compliance markets in the chat too. We will be coming to that. Excellent. So we will shortly move on. If we can just wrap up typing into the chat. I'll let the two participants typing now three participants put in their thoughts, and we shall proceed with the fundamentals. But again, it's really excellent to get a bit of a poll and sense check to see where everyone is at and what kinds of kind of conceptions and preconceptions that people come to this topic with. Fantastic. So, carbon market fundamentals. So, as I mentioned, this is quite a complex slide, but we will unpack it, is that there are really three main types of carbon markets. And what gets really confusing is that sometimes people don't specify which type of carbon market they're talking about, or rather whether they're talking about the ecosystem of carbon markets. And so we can see here on the left, we have the voluntary carbon market. This is often the one people are most directly familiar with. That those are the kinds of credits that you could procure and may procure. For instance, if you're taking a flight and you offset your emissions, you are likely engaging with the voluntary carbon market. So these are forms of project-based outcomes, and they represent typically 1 ton of CO2 of carbon emissions avoided, reduced, or removed. And that distinction does become important when we think about concepts such as net zero, as we'll come to find out. Yet, as we'll also unpack during this lecture, the UNFCCC has been a really important source of project-based developments as well. We know this was true under the Kyoto Protocol, which generated instances and units such as CERS under the Clean Development Mechanism, for instance. But we also see that under the Paris Agreement, which generates what's called internationally tradable mitigation outcomes. Yet at the same time as we have project-based outcomes, we also have systems that are set up based on allowances. There I saw a reference to compliance markets and carbon trading on the previous slide, and these are forms of allowance-based systems. So a clear example of this is emissions trading schemes. For instance, the EU's, there's one in the UK, there's New Zealand, and in fact, actually, as of this year, the World Bank's latest State and Trends report related to compliance markets, actually, for the first time, nearly all middle-income countries also have forms of emissions trading schemes or other compliance systems. And why this matters is because, as we'll unpack, obviously, compliance markets have a mandatory nature. And this mandatory nature means that they actually generate a lot more revenue and climate mitigation potential than the voluntary carbon market. And we can see here some figures comparing the 104 billion that was generated via compliance carbon markets compared to 723 million on the voluntary carbon market. Now, the voluntary carbon market can be very volatile, as we'll also unpack, and so this has swung around quite a bit. But whatever the case, it's clear that there are very different sizes involved. Yet, as you can see, there is some fungibility between the two systems. So some systems such as Singapore, for instance, or South Africa, you're able to surrender a certain proportion of carbon credits to make up for an allowance. Why you might do that is, for instance, project-based carbon credits can often be many times cheaper than compliance carbon pricing. So the advent of fungibility, instead of thinking about the carbon market in three distinct buckets, actually means that we can see trading across all three types and really start to consider the carbon market as a whole ecosystem. So we'll start with voluntary carbon markets. Voluntary carbon markets depend on voluntary demand. And one of the key sources of voluntary demand that we've seen is net zero commitments. So we've seen a wide range of those emerge in recent years. We see now that 142 countries, 195 regions, 283 cities and 1,182 of the world's largest companies have set net zero targets. This is also significant in the context of the Paris Agreement because we know in Article 4.1, there's reference to a balance of sinks and sources of emissions. Basically, in other words, this is a state of net zero. So we've committed to it at the Paris Agreement level, but other actors have also translated that commitment into more specific net zero commitments nationally or regionally or on a more localized level. As I mentioned, the voluntary carbon market is actually where a lot of the project-based credits come from. And it's important here to really understand the full range of carbon credits that there are today. We've seen some questions in the chat, for instance, about the difference between carbon capture and carbon finance. Carbon finance can be used to fund any type of carbon credit, whereas carbon capture is a very specific form of mitigation project. And as we'll unpack a bit later, again, plays a distinct role in a transition to net zero. Then we have forms of quasi-compliance mechanisms, and this is what I term the UNFCCC mechanisms as. And this is because instead of being completely voluntary or completely compliant, they offer flexibility to help reach an international target. We had instances under the Kyoto Protocol, which we'll unpack today, including clean development mechanism, joint implementation as well. But we also have it in terms of the second generation of UN-related carbon markets. We can see this in Article 6.2 as well as 6.4. But as we'll also touch on, there's emerging schemes to cover international aviation as well as international maritime emissions. So really, we have carbon pricing and carbon markets now touching all domains of international emissions. Then finally, but not the least by any means, we have compliance carbon markets. And this is where, as I mentioned, demand is mandated. Now, these tend to be sub-state or domestic or regional in scale. We do have some linking of compliance carbon markets from time to time, linking of emissions trading schemes. For instance, as part of the Brexit agreement, the EU and UK have agreed to reconnect their emissions trading schemes at some point in the future. And this becomes complicated because not only are you bridging different caps in emissions, but it also becomes complicated when we're seeing developments such as the integration of carbon removal into these systems, and again, how to ensure that there is comparability across jurisdictions. And this is a particularly key component of Article 6.2, as we'll come to later. But as you can see here, there's over 75 compliance carbon pricing schemes globally, and this again could be a range from carbon taxes all the way through to emissions trading schemes. But one key question that we often get when thinking about carbon markets is, well, to what extent is it actually a market? And it's important to note that there is significant asymmetries involved in market dynamics. And this tends to lead the carbon market at times to function much more bilaterally than plurilaterally on a kind of open market type of system. And we can see some of the reforms that are needed, again, speak to this issue of treating it as though it was another form of open financial market, when indeed it operates a little bit more opaquely than that. And that creates a lot of issues as we'll unpack, and it also makes, again, not only unpacking individual components of the system difficult, but especially complex when you start to marry them up with one another. But as I mentioned, and some may be aware, we saw reference to greenwashing in the kickoff slide. There are reform efforts underway to really improve the integrity of carbon markets, and again, with a view to ensuring that when they are connected together, that they don't undermine their intended purpose, which is to drive decarbonization, principally in compliance schemes. So where you've got a cap on emissions that declines each year, you are incentivizing investments in reduction, or if not, having to pay the penalty of a allowance. But conversely, with the voluntary carbon market, again, if you're not able to reduce your emissions and you've committed to something like a science-based target or net zero target, then you do have to procure the amount of carbon credits to offset your ongoing emissions. And we see, again, entities that are subject to both compliance regimes, but also do choose to offset via the voluntary carbon market. And what's really interesting, coming back to Article 6, is that that creates the opportunity for countries, in fact, to do this too. So they have the option through their nationally determined contributions to undertake domestic emissions cuts, but they can also use Article 6 to undertake more ambitious action. But in some ways, and in some cases that we've already seen, this can risk supplementing domestic action for overseas and kind of offshoring the solution. And this becomes critical again in terms of the question as to whether these projects are actually delivering the environmental benefits that they claim to. Excellent. So one other key component to mention is that carbon markets have often undergone a cycle of regulation and deregulation. So while we did have carbon markets evolve and emerge under the first generation of UN market mechanisms under the Kyoto Protocol, we soon saw a collapse in demand and as well confidence. And so it was a real question when the Paris Agreement was being negotiated as to whether or not carbon markets would still be one of the tools in the Paris Agreement toolkit. Now, as we know today, because we're talking about carbon markets under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, it did make it into the Paris Agreement, but as you'll recall, Article 6 became the most protracted and difficult part of the Paris Agreement to unpack. And you'll get to understand a little bit about why that was today, because there's so many different components to get right in order to ensure that it is contributing to rather than undermining the goals of the Paris Agreement. But sadly, there's still signs that the system is not working as it should to guarantee environmental integrity. So as you can see here on the left, we're still at risk of a decline in confidence before potentially moving to a much more integrated and higher quality system at some point in the future. But as we all know today, and why COP30 is a very urgent turning point in global climate mitigation, is that we simply don't have that time. So the more lessons we can learn, particularly from the first generation of carbon markets under the Kyoto Protocol, the better. And so we can see here a little bit of a indication about how these three different forms of market have intersected, and as well how they could intersect in the future. And you'll appreciate here as part of this graph, again, that the voluntary carbon market and kind of methodology from there was where the first project came from, and that was back in the 1980s. But really, we've seen two key generations of development since then, which I've mentioned, one in relation to the Kyoto Protocol, and we're now entering a new one of Paris. So turning to the concepts of environmental integrity and the need for net zero alignment. So as I mentioned, both these concepts have made it into the Paris Agreement and were not present under the Kyoto Protocol. So these are two paradigms that are incredibly important to unpack in relation to Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. So what is environmental integrity? Well, environmental integrity has been around for several decades, but really has only been significantly elaborated and iterated as a norm in the recent decade. And this was really as a response to failings of the first generation of carbon credits. And we can see its normative development has happened in a number of ways. We can see the concept shows up in some nationally determined contributions. We know that there was principles back in 2019 developed known as the San Jose principles for high integrity carbon markets. We have, of course, developed our own principles at Oxford about kind of high integrity and net zero aligned offsetting, which again offer contributions as to what environmental integrity looks like. And then we also have those reform efforts that I mentioned that are also trying to improve quality of the units themselves. And we can see here on our right, the core carbon principles are from the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets. So again, thinking about how environmental integrity in theory works, it can apply at different levels. So you could look at an individual project and assess whether that has environmental integrity, but you can really extend that out to the whole ecosystem. And that becomes important again because of those interlinkages between different systems. But really, in terms of how we may define it, there's three key ways that we could think about it within the context of the Paris Agreement. Does it result in achieving our mitigation targets that are often set in our nationally determined contributions or our long-term low emissions development strategies? Are global aggregate emissions staying the same as a result of them, or are they actually decreasing? And we see here an acronym that is commonly talked about in terms of Article 6, which is OMGE, which stands for the Overall Mitigation in Global Emissions. And we'll unpack a little bit later. This was again one of these key developments that made it into the Paris Agreement carbon market regime that did not previously exist. But we can really think about environmental integrity in four key ways. So we can think about it in terms of the unit quality. So does the carbon credit or other form of mitigation outcome actually have quality in terms of do we know that it's got been subject to MRV, which means having a quality methodology that has then been reported and verified against? Do we know that it has additionality? So in other words, would the project have gone ahead otherwise? Could it have been already financially viable? Could it have already been mandated by a particular policy? And when we can think in terms of carbon trading, is there a robust cap? Because if you don't have a robust cap that provides a decarbonization signal, again, the quality and value of an allowance within that system means very little. We can then also think about nationally determined contributions, ambition, and breadth. So again, we need to, one of the key parts and agreements of the Paris Agreement is to have a ratcheting mechanism whereby ambition is scaled over time. And so again, when we're aggregating up all the different commitments that countries make towards reaching the Paris Agreement's targets, it's really important, and in fact, part of the Paris Agreement, that we're ensuring that this is the highest ambition. But this gets complex when we start thinking about Article 6 a little bit more directly. Next, we have robust accounting, and I saw someone did mention double counting at the start of our session today. This is key because, again, learning the lessons from the first generation of carbon markets, we do know that there were some instances of fraud whereby someone may have been double claiming the same type of unit. We can also have double issuance. So sometimes, again, these projects operate with not a lot of transparency or visibility. And so in many ways, different people have called them a kind of Wild West. And so the accounting piece is really key. Yet there's some other components of accounting that it's important to consider. So net zero pertains to greenhouse gases. Now, carbon is one form of greenhouse gas, but it's the most common form that carbon credits are produced. So we can see here, if you've got a project that is dealing with methane, it's important to accurately convert that back to carbon in order to trade that. And again, if depending on the scientific robustness of your calculation, you can easily overcredit and again undermine your accounting. But we also have to consider vintages, and vintages describe when the project actually occurred. Now, it may surprise you, but oftentimes on the voluntary carbon market, we can see entities still retiring credits that were generated or from the vintage of 2006, 2007. And when we think about that, if an entity is retiring a carbon credit based on a project 20 years old, we can very clearly know that that's actually not having any kind of environmental benefit. But worse than that, if that company is choosing to emit because it's purchased that carbon credit, we can actually end up worse off than when we started. And this brings me to the latter point. So again, we need to ensure that all the systemic incentives that underlie the development of carbon markets do point to incentivizing techno-economic developments, and again, don't hold them back. And so again, one of the key considerations in negotiating Article 6 was to what extent does it and can it avoid technological lock-in? So this being where technologies, for instance, natural gas, may be installed, but actually that only further locks in emissions rather than offering systemic transformations. So we can see environmental integrity in practice in a number of different ways. Here it is as expressed in the original Oxford offsetting principles. We can see here that this means using offsets that are verifiable, correctly accounted for, have a low risk of non-additionality, reversal, and creating negative unintended consequences for people and the environment. And the last point is critical because these carbon projects are happening in communities. And whilst they can have co-benefits, these could include, for instance, job benefits, employment, they can also have real costs for the communities. And we can see some types of projects that result in Indigenous peoples being alienated from their lands and not having a say over how their, homes are being utilized. And this becomes particularly problematic again when depending on what is being used or why that carbon credit is being used in the first place, and especially so if it's being used to continue to emit fossil emissions. And again, environmental integrity has been really critical as a lens to apply back to various types of projects. And indeed, this one was a very famous news article from a few years ago, which, as you can see with this headline, actually revealed that over 90% of one of the world's biggest carbon credit projects, run by one of the biggest certifiers, did not have environmental integrity. So they were kind of phantom credits. You may also have heard the term trading hot air. Now, this is all critical and really does speak to the fact that getting this right is complex. And as we'll come to with the oxide offsetting principles, that's why it's really important we ensure that wherever there's opportunities to mitigate emissions first, i.e. reduce them, we need to do that rather than relying on carbon credits or offsetting. That said, carbon credits can be a powerful financing tool. And so that is why there is opportunity through Article 6 to channel financing in that way if we get it right. So why is environmental integrity important? Well, again, as I mentioned, there's various levels that we can think about it operating within. And it's fundamental to drive enhanced mitigation ambition. And that's both whether you're talking about at the corporate level or at the country level. So now we've unpacked a little bit about what environmental integrity means. We'll now come to net zero. So as you can see here, net zero emissions are achieved when anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere are balanced by anthropogenic removals over a specified period. So two key bits in here that are really important. It has to do with reaching a balance between emissions and removals, but equally the word anthropogenic. So it does not concern things such as carbon removal that happens anyway because of, say, carbon fertilization, what happens with the greenhouse effect and plants absorbing more CO2. That doesn't count as an anthropogenic removal. And what we're really talking about is the balance between those two things. So why is it critical that we align carbon markets with net zero? Well, we know that reaching net zero, which is that balance between sinks and sources, is the only thing that we can do to A, stabilize global concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but B, actually bring them down. And only by bringing them down do we help pare back some of the warming that's already baked into the overall atmospheric system. And you may have heard of the concept of a carbon budget. Well, we're very fastly running out of the carbon budget that we have to stay within the 1.5 degree envelope. And those familiar with Article 2 of the Paris Agreement will know that the temperature goal there is to achieve or to limit temperature rise to well below 2 degrees, pursuing efforts for 1.5. So it's critical that we reach this net zero balance as soon as we can in order to stabilize temperatures. And ultimately, carbon removal, in fact, is our only tool we have to actually bring temperatures down. And this, you may know, as a kind of concept called overshoot. So if you overshoot our carbon budget, the only thing we can do to pull it back is carbon removal. So in other words, we need to move from a situation where we are today, where we're extracting a lot of emissions from the lithosphere, so things like fossil fuels and other industrial processes. We're putting those into the atmosphere and we're relying a lot on the land and ocean biosphere to uptake that CO2. So we need to move to a state of net zero where these are actually balanced. But more than that, if we just balance them, that only temporarily stabilizes global emissions. So what we need to ensure and move towards is actually a state of durable net zero. And so this is where we're returning every emission we get from the lithosphere, from the long carbon cycles involved in producing fossil fuels, back to those same reservoirs and storing them on the same geological timescale, because only then do we have confidence that we have durably balanced emissions. So, the sad news and why one of the key tasks we have today is really focusing in on what types of projects carbon markets are financing and how they can become efficient tools is because they are not yet net zero aligned. So, and this is both speaking to project-based ones, but also compliance-based systems. And so some emissions trading schemes still have free allocation of emission allowance units. Whereas carbon credits can equally sometimes be used to address emissions that otherwise could have been reduced anyway. We also know, and as you'll remember from that headline that I showed you, we can see fraudulent practices or just poor quality methodologies that can lead to a state of atmospheric default, and this being an instance where we are removing a lot less than we thought we were from the atmosphere, or indeed could even be emitting than when we thought we were reducing emissions. But again, what's interesting, and we'll unpack this a little bit further, but reductions and removals have unique incentives. So we know that carbon removal credits are 3 times more expensive than durable carbon, than typical offsets, whether those are renewable energy or cook stove credits and whatnot, or kind of REDD Plus credits you may be aware of. But when we look to the more durable kinds of carbon removals, they're actually 100 times more expensive. And so without carefully shaping our market practice, we will simply not reach net zero through the use of carbon markets alone. Some additional considerations, as I mentioned, the cost becomes a big factor because if you leave it to an open market, cost becomes the biggest determinant. Equally, credibility, as I mentioned, vintage is key. So when was the credit generated, and does it still make sense to use it to offset your emissions today? Availability. So one really interesting thing about the global carbon market and credit system is, and you'll find this also in the 2025 version of the World Bank State and Trends of Carbon Pricing report, that is several hundred million legacy carbon credits that still exist. So you can have a well-meaning purchaser who wants to go and fund some climate mitigation, who could be caught out by buying these really old carbon credits that just don't represent real mitigation. Procurement, there are a number of different options. So again, sometimes there's traditional market brokers. So you can go log on to a platform and buy that via a broker. You can also see direct procurement and even some forms now of advanced market commitments, similar to how vaccines developed, where actors place upfront promise to finance a certain units. And this is particularly key for the very expensive but very valuable for the future forms of durable carbon removal. One other thing to note is there's not only offsetting, so i.e. buying carbon credits outside your value chain. Some actors are doing a form of insetting, so developing forms of carbon credits where you can track how much tons of CO2 are avoided, reduced, or removed within your value chain. So for instance, you may have a factory that has some land, you may be planting your own trees and measuring how much CO2 those trees are taking up and counting that against your emissions inventory. But equally, what's really interesting in the era of the Paris Agreement, which is the world's first kind of global emissions mitigation agreement, is that we really do have to consider to what extent has a project already been factored into existing Paris Agreement emission reduction commitments, and as we'll unpack a bit further, whether or not it has a corresponding adjustment does also really matter. So with these principles in mind, I'd like to now spend a bit of time just introducing the Oxford offsetting principles. And this is a guide we put together to really inform what net zero aligned offsetting could look like. Principle 1 relates to the need to cut your emissions, ensure the environmental integrity of credits used to achieve net zero, and to regularly revise your offsetting strategy as best practice evolves. No surprises there. We know that reducing emissions is far easier than trying to develop a carbon credit project and having confidence that that's delivering that mitigation that you intend. But equally, that science is evolving all the time. And so you need to ensure that your offsetting strategy really does reflect best practice. And that could even be that there are new forms of technology that could actually decarbonize your sector before relying on carbon credits. Equally, we know it's vital to transition to carbon removal offsetting for any residual emissions in order to reach global net zero. As we remember, net zero is a balance between your emissions out and your removals. But we know that's not enough to durably restore levels of CO2 in the atmosphere to a stable concentration and ultimately to reduce them. So we need to ensure that those removals have durable storage, which means there's a low risk of them re-releasing their emissions on a net zero relevant timeline. And fourthly, here, and perhaps most importantly, even if every actor went out today to follow principles 1 to 3, there's simply not enough carbon removal out there to be able to do that. And we need to ensure that the signals and pathways for development are there today, which involves the use of integrated and innovative approaches. Now, I can see some really interesting questions coming up. Please do save those for the Q&A component, and I'd love to dive into them then. And so what does this look like over time? So we can see here that you could have a portfolio that's transitioning to durable carbon removal over time. You can also see that other forms of carbon credits can be used as a contribution rather than compensation over time. So it's not the case that carbon credits can't finance all types of projects, but that some carbon credits are used and can be used for offsetting versus broader contribution to global climate action. And so what do some of the examples of kind of innovative and integrated approaches actually look like? So we can see creating long-term agreements. We can see the importance of de-risking project finance. So some of the carbon projects are big infrastructure investments. We also know and have seen that forming sector-specific alliances can help, as can actually valuing and supporting the protection and restoration of nature in and of its own right, as opposed to any offsetting benefits that it could do. Equally, it's important to provide that certainty for developers as well as for corporates and other actors who are exploring offsetting. And it's equally important to invest in additional beyond value chain mitigation, such as through contribution credits and claims. Practically, as a corporate organization, this could mean developing an internal carbon price or organizational carbon removal budget. But again, that piece of regular revision is key. So now we're turning to the history of UN-related carbon market pricing mechanisms. And so you've got an understanding now of the fundamentals of carbon markets, as well as a flavor of what environmental integrity means, as well as net zero. So turning to unpack the history of carbon trading under the Kyoto Protocol. So stretching back, the Kyoto Protocol was adopted back in 1997. It is an agreement that came under the broad framework for climate change, known as the UNFCCC. And critically, the agreement actually entered into force in 2005. And it marked a significant turning point, principally because it was the first time, and indeed the only time, that countries have agreed to concrete, legally binding targets. Now, this was not all countries. So legally binding targets applied to Annex 1 countries, and these commitments required them to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by, on average, 5% below 1990 levels during the first commitment period. And there was also a non-binding recommendation that applied to non-Annex 1 countries. So these are developing nations principally. Now, coming back to kind of the rationale behind carbon markets as an option, the Kyoto Protocol was very influenced by the economic principle of carbon pricing and that kind of efficiency and potential scale that that could bring. And so use of them as a market mechanism that could provide flexibility became what's known as a red line by, for instance, the United States in the negotiations of the Kyoto Protocol. And so that is how they were baked into it. What did that practically look like? And what I really find helpful when unpacking some of these mechanisms, and this is true, whatever part of the Paris Agreement or whatever negotiation stream you're concentrating on, it's really helpful. Just go and read the article that informs that. negotiation stream. And we know that there were three forms of carbon trading that emerged under the Kyoto Protocol. The first being international emissions trading. So this allowed countries who had overachieved their emission reduction commitments to actually trade those units with another. Now, this still led to forms of hot air trading because it depended on where that baseline back in 1990 actually left us. And we know that, for instance, there was significant, deindustrialization within the what was the former Soviet Union at that time. And that meant that the baselines were overinflated in many respects. And so, in essence, hot air was able to kind of make its way into the system via that mechanism. Then we have the two project-based crediting mechanisms. We have the Clean Development Mechanism under Article 12. The Clean Development Mechanism is often the one people think of first when they think of carbon trading under the Kyoto Protocol. And this principally operated to allow investments in emissions reductions and some limited removal projects from Annex 1 countries to non-Annex 1 countries. In return, the countries received certified emission reductions, these CERs, which equated to 1 ton of CO2 equivalent. And again, full range of projects, and the project methodologies often came from the voluntary carbon market but had to be endorsed in order to generate CERs under the UNFCCC mechanism. We then have joint implementation under Article 6, and this was a much smaller mechanism, but this really engaged Annex 1 countries to implement emission reduction projects in other Annex 1 countries. And so very similar to emissions tradings, but again, it instead of looking at just the direct balance sheet of emissions, it actually financed projects. But there was a lot of implementation issues with that. And so there's a lot of, by contrast, a lot of lessons that were learned. For instance, additionality. There was real questions about whether the reductions would have happened anyway. As I mentioned, all of these types of projects happen in local communities and can affect and impact the rights of them, and including Indigenous peoples. So the Kyoto Protocol did not have a grievance mechanism, so a way for communities to complain about projects or developers that had, been causing harmful impacts on their communities. And oftentimes also there was a real absence of meaningful consultations with the community. And this mattered greatly, especially when a lot of finance was being generated that would not go back to the local community, but would remain in the hands of a few project developers. There was also issues related to the monitoring, verification, and reporting frameworks related to how these units were generated. So there's a real lack of confidence that the units that were generated were actually real. And we'll come to that in a second. There was also a number of perverse market incentives and market manipulation examples. And one of the key ones that we've put here is that really that there was evidence that some companies were actually increasing emissions of a particular type of gas, the HFC types of gas, that they could then get paid to address because it was more profitable for them to emit more and get paid to reduce it than it was to just never have done it at all. We also saw that least developed countries were largely excluded. So the large emerging developing economies, China and India, saw the bulk of project development, but many countries missed out. And we also know that there was significant volatility in terms of the price of these units and thus the decarbonization signal. And this really posed a problem when carbon markets, even in the first generation, began to be interlinked. Because what happened is that they were interlinked, for instance, with the European Union's emissions trading scheme, and they then crashed. As you can see here, they went from 20 euros a ton in 2008 to below 50 euro cents by 2014. And so this resulted in the EU banning their integration or removing their integration from the emissions trading scheme. Bear in mind, as you know, we're now the second generation where these interconnections between project-based credits and emissions trading schemes are being explored again. And so again, it's critical we learn these lessons from the past. So what do we know about the types of projects and what they were actually delivering? Well, here we have a study from Probst et al. That found that out of the close to 1 billion credits that emerged from the Clean Development Mechanism, 812 million likely did not constitute real emission reductions. And you can see that that was not the same for all types of units. We can see that some units, achieved genuine emission reductions, but in other types, nearly all likely did not. And so this casts a lot of doubt on the credibility of the system. And a lot of these credits that did not have atmospheric integrity did in fact come from the Kyoto Protocol. And so this really illustrates that such mechanisms can bring real scale, close to 1 billion credits were generated, but equally can bring real harm if those credits are not real, and that harm is not only to the environment in terms of not representing real emission reductions, but critically also to local communities. So this brings us to unpacking Article 6. So Article 6 is the part of the Paris Agreement that houses carbon trading mechanisms. It is this linchpin of the future global carbon market ecosystem because it sets up the possibility of exchange and interchange between forms of compliance carbon markets as well as voluntary carbon markets. And it really can either increase nationally determined contribution or commitments, ambition, or it could undermine them. So again, I find it really helpful to just pull the part of the Paris Agreement that Article 6 is so you can read it here in front of you. And so Article 6.1 simply says that parties recognize that some parties choose to pursue voluntary cooperation in the implementation of their nationally determined contributions to allow for higher ambition in their mitigation and adaptation actions and to promote sustainable development and environmental integrity. So as I mentioned, this was the first time that sustainable development and environmental integrity were actually embedded within the carbon trading framework under the UN. And so this is significant. And we can see here equally some kind of signals that this is a voluntary part of the Paris Agreement, B, that it should result in higher ambition, and then C, these new concepts of sustainable development and environmental integrity. And what's interesting is you'll recall there was 3 different forms of carbon trading under the Kyoto Protocol. Under the Paris Agreement, there's 2 forms of carbon trading and 1 form of non-market approaches. And so we can see here Article 6.2, which speaks to cooperative approaches. And this is where the generation and trade of mitigation outcomes occurs. This is similar to both the international emissions trading scheme that we have under the Kyoto Protocol, but equally the kind of system where emissions trading schemes generally could be interlinked. We then have Article 6.4. This is now known as the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism, and basically represents what the clean development mechanism and joint implementation schemes under the Kyoto Protocol used to get for. And then 6.8, which describes non-market approaches. And so it can be helpful to kind of think through practically what are examples of what this actually means. We can see here that 6.2, an example could be that a country is investing in renewable energy. It happens to exceed its emissions reduction target and creates a surplus. And then another country which needs to reduce its emissions could buy some of country A's surplus and count it towards its own NDC. So country A would add emissions to their emissions balance and then transfer those same emissions as a minus on country B, and that would occur as a result of financing. So again, very similar to international emissions trading that happened under the Kyoto Protocol. 6.4, by contrast, relates to project financing. An example here could be another country's financing a reforestation project, generating carbon credits. Now, these credits could be bought by a country. They could also be bought by a corporate. And indeed, as we'll unpack, it could even be bought by an airline who does actually need to buy a correspondingly adjusted credit under the CORSIA scheme. So we can see here again that Article 6.2 and 6.4, although different levers of the Paris Agreement, do actually converge by reference to this notion of corresponding adjustments. We also have Article 6.8, which as mentioned is non-market approaches. And this was a key kind of part of the agreement struck in Paris Recognizing that the carbon market and trading system has had a lot of issues, there was an intention to introduce non-market approaches as well. And so this is where Article 6.8 comes in. So how did the mandate that we saw in Article 6.1 actually translate to the negotiating room? So back in 2015, the overall architecture of the Paris Agreement was agreed, but still negotiations had to occur as to what the rulebook actually looked like. So what did Article 6 mean in practice? We know, and as I mentioned, that this was the most protracted of all the parts of the Paris Agreement, and in fact took until 2021 COP26 to agree the overall rulebook. There were some innovations here. So at COP26, parties agreed to apply corresponding adjustments to all forms of mitigation outcomes so that a reduction is only counted once by one country inventory. There was also agreement on a mandatory 2% cancellation rate, and this comes back to the acronym I introduced earlier of overall mitigation and global emissions. And this was significant because for the first time, emissions trading wasn't one for one or ton for ton. Actually, they said that if you're using this Article 6.4, or what's known as the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism now, that you actually should be purchasing more units than you need to overall put a contribution back to the environment and actually reduce your emissions there. Similarly, and as you recall from 6.1, adaptation features here. And so both part of 6.2, but it's mandatory under 6.4. There is a mandatory contribution known as share of proceeds for adaptation, again, via any transaction. There's also now a grievance mechanism under the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism, which did not exist previously. And this provides an important outlet for communities that may be harmed during the projects in themselves. And equally, and as you recall, there's an emphasis on sustainable development. So as part of the project activity cycle, parties and activity developers have to demonstrate how the project delivers on sustainable development objectives. And so these are all examples of innovations under the Paris Agreement, which we did not have in relation to carbon trading under the Kyoto Protocol. But there were some potential steps backwards. So we can still know that there was voluntary cancellation under 6.2 for overall mitigation in global emissions. And in fact, there was significant transfers of clean development credits, those SIR units we discussed, that could be brought into the Article 6 system. Now, we'll unpack the numbers of those very shortly, but close to 1 billion of those units could come through. And again, this has real implications for the environmental integrity of the overall system. So in essence, at COP26, we did actually have a package that delivered a higher amount of environmental integrity than most anticipated back in the previous round of negotiations in 2019. In fact, red lines increased, and it looked potentially likely that there wasn't going to be an outcome on Article 6 at all. Yet, the devil remains in the detail of this mechanism, and we'll see why. So now I wanted to share some up-to-date insights as to where developments are at in terms of the different parts of Article 6 carbon trading. As of July 2025, there are over 100 memorandums of understanding that have been put in place by countries. This is a foundational piece of agreeing a cooperative approach which could result in carbon trading. Part of this, we know that there's 11 countries that have indicated an interest in buying mitigation outcomes, principally for their use towards nationally determined contributions, and over 53 host countries that are interested in setting up and hosting those projects where they could transfer units from. And we have about 26 pilot projects underway. In terms of size, we know that this is estimated, at least the current project pipeline, estimated to generate close to 7 million tons of CO2 equivalent annually by 2030. You can see here some examples, and these examples, if you're familiar with the voluntary carbon market, will look very similar and result in a full range of project types. So we can see reducing charcoal consumption through improved cook stoves, projects like battery energy storage or e-mobility projects or electrification through solar power, really a raft of different project types. But what's critical to understand is 6.2 sets very little expectations pertaining methodological requirements for mitigation outcome trading. And in fact, it all depends on the robustness of setting your nationally determined contribution and how you apply those corresponding adjustments to it. So there's a number of outstanding questions. And so we know from the first rounds of the kind of pilot projects that there has been some issues. So for instance, here you can see two examples of the projects that Switzerland, who was an early adopter of Article 6.2, undertook. Some of these issues related to financing, for instance, e-buses in Bangkok that were already driving around when the finance occurred. So again, that financial additionality piece really came into question. We also know that there's a lot of tensions and still things to be worked out between how the UNFCCC sits on the one hand, parties and countries' kind of national inventories and accounting mechanisms sit on the other, and then the private carbon crediting programs, which produce the methodologies and may also be involved in verifying and validating credits. So how do these three parties actually come together? And what's really interesting is an agreement at COP29 last year in Azerbaijan was that the UNFCCC could provide parties without their own national carbon register with some registry services. But what's really interesting, and again, you'll recall, environmental integrity was a key objective of Article 6 overall. So it was super interesting to see here this paragraph 53, where we can clearly see that while the Secretariat is offering registry services, they're very clear that just because the UNFCCC is involved with delivering these units, that they're not offering any kind of endorsement as to the environmental integrity of those mitigation outcomes. So again, we can see some red warning lights pertaining to what's likely to come out of that pipeline. And again, one of the key issues relates to how do we actually ensure, coming back to that definition of environmental integrity, that use of this mechanism is raising NDC ambition rather than undermining it. And we've seen some examples here raised in some of the first reporting cycles under Article 6.2, for instance, biennial transparency reports and technical expert reviews, both of which came out for the first time earlier this year and highlighted some critical issues related to how Article 6.2 cooperative approaches function. We'll then turn to Article 6.4. Article 6.4 is that Paris Agreement crediting mechanism creates a centralized mechanism as opposed to the more bilateral or plurilateral Article 6.2. One of the key first steps in enabling trade or participation in the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism is your country setting up a designated national authority. And we know as of July, there are 109 designated national authorities. So that's more than half of the countries around the world have signaled that they will be taking part in the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism. As I mentioned before, there's close to 1 billion tons of former CDM credits that have applied for recognition through the new Article 6.4 system. But at the same time, we can also see that there are over 1,000 new projects that have expressed prior notification of their intention to develop under the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism. So as well as having some transfer over of legacy credits from the Clean Development Mechanism, Article 6.4 will also deliver new forms of projects. Yet out of over 1,000 projects, and coming back to that definition of net zero alignment, we know that only 64 of them are any type of carbon removal, and only 4 of them are actually durable carbon removal. And even then, it's a form of durable carbon removal, which is one of the least durable forms of that type of engineered carbon removal, and that's in the form of biochar. So we can see there's a significant step up from 6.2, both in terms of the potential size of the emissions that are being generated through the new Paris Agreement crediting mechanism projects. Here you can see 61 million tons of CO2 annually, but we also know that there's these legacy CERs transferring into the system. We don't yet know how many there are, because what's interesting is now the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism depends on methodological review. And so over the course of this year, we'll likely see the first brand new issuance of 6.4 units, but we do not have that yet, both for the legacy Clean Development Mechanism units, but as well for the new Paris Agreement crediting mechanism projects. Similar to cooperative approaches in the broader voluntary carbon market, example projects that will come up under 6.4 relate to things like landfill gas recovery, safe drinking water, a wind farm project. And again, the flavor of different countries, you can get that impression that these are happening all around the world. And indeed, some countries are both seeking to develop their own projects and purchase the results of different projects. So we can see a lot of prospect for international collaboration. But there's a lot of questions still at play. So how much of carryover will actually occur from the clean development mechanism? Again, this depends on how stringently the Article 6.4 supervisory body actually applies their criteria related to environmental integrity. But this will be a critical first test for the mechanism. Equally, it'll be a first test as to who's using these 6.4 emission reductions. And are those people using them, particularly if they're countries, actually using them to go above their previous ambition within their nationally determined contributions, or are they seeking to greenwash using the mechanism? There's also some real questions related to how the system will impact the development of carbon removals. For instance, some of the innovations that I mentioned, the 5% share of proceeds to the adaptation fund and 2% mandatory cancellation for overall mitigation and global emissions, results in a 7% additional fee that you have to pay for every unit you procure. And again, if you recall, when we're talking about some units that are 100 times more expensive than other forms of general offsets, this can cause some barriers for development. And so while it's quite a technical area, it's one that we do a lot of work and thinking on here at Oxford. Similarly, there's implications for CORSIA, which is the airline's offsetting scheme, and we'll come back to that shortly. And again, we have real concerns over the quality of credits. And so we can see here some early analysis of one of the projects that has applied to generate credits. And we can see here an estimate that only 1 in every 26 of those credits is actually likely to have represented real emissions reductions. Then finally, we'll just unpack very shortly the kind of often forgotten piece of the Article 6 puzzle, which is those non-market approaches. This has seen very little development in comparison. So we saw much bigger numbers in relation to 6.2 and 6.4 developments. But practically, this looks like a portal, which you can go and log into online today, and it is meant to offer prospects of support as well as capacity building and trading. And in fact, now that the negotiations for 6.2 and 6.4 have largely concluded, 6.8 is where there's still contention, and we saw that as recently as Bonn. And for further information, I'll paste in a link to that summarizes what issues were at play at Bonn as well, because Article 6.8 was one of the most contentious there. So just briefly, in our last kind of time we have together as part of this first component of the session, just like to quickly introduce some of the frontiers of carbon markets as they relate to aviation and maritime. So as mentioned, CORSIA is a system for global airlines and the aviation industry, but more broadly. And it was developed quite a while ago now, but has entered through a pilot phase, and we're now part of this first phase. And so this is where ICAO states, countries, have volunteered to be a part of the system. And so that means that any carriers operating within their jurisdiction then have to procure enough enough offsets to cover their growth in emissions. So again, what's really important, and compared to maybe a compliance system, CORSIA is designed to only cover an increase in emissions from the baseline, but it's not addressing the full extent of emissions. So, that's why I call it a quasi-compliance mechanism, because it does not address fully all of the emissions, but it could offer both an incentive for airlines to reduce their emissions, but as well to obviously compensate for their ongoing emissions here. And we can see here that CORSIA scheme is due to run through for the next 10 years, right through to 2035, and will become mandatory in 2027. But it really does matter in kind of understanding, how broad is it? To what extent are countries covered by it? As you can see here, a number of countries that have volunteered to take part has increased quite significantly from 88 in 2021, as well all the way to 129 now in 2025. We also know that there's different countries are setting up schemes to address non-compliance. So say if an airline doesn't comply and procure the offsets that it should have done through CORSIA, it could be subject to a non-compliance penalty. And the UK, for instance, was consulting on a £100 per ton penalty, which is very significant when we're thinking about airlines that could be required to offset in the hundreds of millions tons of CO2. We can also see projections related to supply and demand and whether or not it could match. And what's really interesting here is, again, a lot of this depends on what counts as a CORSIA eligible offset. As I mentioned, these have to be correspondingly adjusted. So they have to filter through the Article 6 system, either through 6.2 or as a result of Article 6.4 emission reductions. But CORSIA sets very limited parameters in terms of the quality of units, and in fact, doesn't even guarantee permanence of a unit after 2035. Whereas we know we not only have to be thinking about the type of credit, where there is an avoidance, reduction, or removal credit, we actually have to be thinking about its role in contributing to a durable state of net zero. So as you can see here, while there's been limited progress to date, market actors do have agency and responsibility to shift in how they may approach a system like CORSIA to bring us closer to global net zero. Yet aviation is not the only global sector that sits outside the Paris Agreement. We also have international maritime emissions. And this is hot off the press. You can see here, it's a very recent development just this year in 2025 that the International Maritime Organization approved its own version of net zero regulations for global shipping. They will go into practice and be voted on by IMO member states later this year. But it's important to say that this scheme will mean that from 2028, owners of large international vessels will need to start decreasing their use of carbon-intensive fuels, or they could face a penalty of up to $380 per ton of CO2. Again, when we can think about some forms of carbon credits selling for $1 or $2, $380 is a significant chunk of money. And so we can see here, actually, it's quite a sophisticated system, and it's again working towards trying to strike this balance between ensuring reductions and wherever possible that emissions are just directly reduced before relying on forms of offsetting. And so you can see here, if an operator has just gone over, and so it's part of the tier 1 breach, the price of a remedial unit is $100. But if they're severely in breach, then again, that could go up to $380. And so again, the implications will be quite significant moving forward in the future. So at the same time as it's a more sophisticated system, there's been a lot of developments in terms of how it's applied. There's still questions as to whether or not it is ambitious enough and actually will put us on track for net zero. And so, another proposal on the table was for a universal levy. And so some do think that that would have been a more efficient way to deliver both mitigation directly within vessels, but also mitigation as a result of purchasing remedial units, which in effect could operate a bit like a carbon credit. So to summarize, I'd also like to illustrate a bit about how you can get involved within the UNFCCC processes, and this is true across the board. For instance, anyone that's under 35 is able to join Younger, which is the global youth constituency for the UNFCCC, and they have different work streams that you can get involved with, including one related to carbon markets and Article 6. And this is actually how I got involved in Article 6 5 years ago during my PhD, was indeed through Younger. It's also Ringo, which is the Research and Independent NGO constituency. Here again, you can sign up online to their platform, and this also provides a really critical view of a number of different negotiation streams. Unlike Youngo, which does undertake advocacy, Ringo doesn't have an advocacy position, but still is able to provide scientific input into these processes. And actually, last year we launched an Article 6 specific work stream. So, again, if you're interested in learning more about these issues and working on them through the negotiations, here are two options. But I also wanted to flag that there can be ways to get involved with your national focal point. And once I stop sharing my screen, I'll paste in a link where you can access the UNEP kind of database of Article 6 developments. And if you scroll along the tabs, you'll be able to find which countries have got a focal point, and again, some information about how to reach out to them and to indeed see, is your country active within the Article 6 framework or not? But in summary, and as we approach time, just worth saying that environmental integrity is essential for carbon market mechanisms to deliver net zero, but ultimately the aims of the Paris Agreement. Now, the Kyoto Protocol largely failed in this intention, and as a result, produced a lot of lessons for the Paris Agreement to build off of. But there was indeed a number of very protracted and lengthy negotiations to try and get the Article 6 rules right. While the broad framework was agreed at COP26, it has led to a complex second generation of carbon markets. Now, all the rules are not fully fleshed out, and indeed, under 6.4, the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism, as close as Monday, where they're doing a consultation about a very key component of that system, which is how it was going to deal with reversal risk. There's plenty of opportunities to still shape the mechanism, and actually 6.4 will also be undertaking its first review in 2028. So while there are chances to learn from the lessons of not only the Kyoto Protocol, but also first instances of practice under Article 6, there are still some warning signs that we're seeing. And this is particularly problematic when we're starting to see the convergence between voluntary carbon markets and compliance carbon markets again, which caused some issues last time round, if you remember, with the EU emissions trading scheme, for instance, disestablishing the connection to the clean development mechanism. But we can also see that it's not just country-based emissions jurisdictionally that matter now, and that international aviation and maritime emissions have also got the sectoral schemes. And, this means that this is the first year that we're really starting to see a truly global carbon market arise, again, which has both opportunities as well as risks involved. So we're at time now. I'll close my screen and look forward to next parts of the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Enji, for this insightful presentation. We're now having our youth speaker. He would be speaking with us about his experience about the Prime Student Sustainability Award as the global winner. And also after his speech, we will be having our Q&A segment. So we'll be having all the questions asked. So please feel free, any participant, feel free to put your question in the chat and also raise your hand. So now, without further ado, let's introduce Mr. Nir Soni. Mr. Nir is the Prime Students Regional Leader for Central and South Asia, and also the Prime Students Sustainability Award Global Winner. So please, Mr. Nir, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Basil, for inviting me here. It's late night in India, but I hear that youth are coming in the forum, and I really want to interact with them. Thank you, Christina and Dr. Johnston. You are really wonderful. You really presented them well. So before taking this opportunity about speaking about the Prime Global experience, I would like to motivate you that I want to cover some topic that we are privileged to discuss all these things. But there are some people in the society who are really facing the challenge. So we all are gathered here. We belong to different cities. We are different citizens of different country. We are different languages, different flags. But what unites us is one thing, that our home, the planet. And right now, the home is at fire. Everyone knows that carbon emissions are there, wildfires are there, floods are there. But it is harsh reality that climate change doesn't affect everyone equally. For many of us sitting in a room, when the heat rises, we have air conditioner to turn it on. When floods come, we have insurance. When drought hit, we see the headlines in a news channel, like in the newspaper, that drought hit this part of region. But we do not see the empty buckets. But over 3 billion people across the global south in the part of Africa, Asia, Latin America, island nations, and India too. Climate change is not a conference topic that to be discussed in an air-conditioned room. It's a fight for daily survival. Let me tell you what climate change look like for the poor people. A mother in a sub-Saharan African walking 10 kilometers daily to fetch a water for their children. A child in Bangladesh losing their school due to floods every year. A farmer in Latin America watching their land sink under the rising tides, forced to become a climate refugee. Do you think this is injustice? Yes, this is. They didn't just cause this because these people are not contributing to pollution much. According to one data, the poorest 50% world population contribute less than 10% of the global pollution. So we are the one who are emitting the more pollution and facing it the least. I would like to basically just quickly play the clip developed by Hindustan Unilever to showcase that message.
एक दिन हमारे गांव में किसी ने नहाने का सावर रख दिया। हमारे आधे गांव ने पानी पी लिया और एक शहर वाले का नहाना अभी खत्म ना हुआ।
I hope this message created a emotion in your heart. These people are not a part of this conference that you discuss United Nations. We are discussing the problem in sitting in air-conditioned room. Like this shows that when we took a shower, we do not care about the water we waste every day. What I want to say here that we are privileged that we have ability to fight the climate change. We are not facing in the front line, but they are the poor people who are facing in the front line, who are facing day by day problem due to this activity. They have resilience to fight this. They have courage to fight this, but they need support. They need support from us. I urge all the youth present here, if you have education, develop a solution. I can tell you one story. Today I was washing my dish utensils and I just came with the idea that if I gather some chemical engineers and some good people from the science background, can we develop one organic or eco-friendly dishwasher which cannot pollute the water? So these are some ideas that all the youth can come together. The PRME is the platform which provide you that, hey guys, I'm in this part of the country, I have this idea. I think your country face this problem. We can exchange the ideas too. So PRME provide a platform. And I always carry one thought in my mind that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So while discussing in the global forum, while discussing in an air-conditioned room, we are really creating a solution. But I think these are the solutions which business need. These are the solutions which take a long-term impact. But right now, at current point of time, there are people who need our help right away. I can call many incidents from India, like one state in India is Uttarakhand. Yeah, couple of 2-3 days back, there's a cloud burst, 100 people killed. There's a flood in the Uttarakhand part of India, flood in Bangladesh. So these are the people who are getting killed. So it's time to not to just discuss in the conference. We have to get on the ground and do the work really hard. So this is my message to youth. And more now I want to discuss about PRME, my experience. So experience the PRME Global Forum was really good. The team of Christina worked really hard to get it better. People from every part of the world came. We discussed the ideas, how we can inculcate sustainability in our curriculum, how we can create a more responsible leaders. So I encourage every youth from wherever you are, whatever background you have, just be loud, be bold. Your voice is loud enough to be heard. PRM is a platform which give your voice. And I believe it's not time to ask someone or wait someone to they will come and give us a mic and you speak your problem, we are ready to hear. No. You have to go to the person, you have to speak loud. Because after 10 or 20 years back, when a child asks you, Father, what you have done for the nation, what you have done for the people who are drowning in the flood, and you are at the top of the building and seeing them drowning, what you have done. You should be able to answer them responsibility that, son, I have done this for them. So it's time to create a change, not just to discuss in the conference, writing the papers. Education part is important, but I think now theory should be converted into practicality. It's a fact that after 25 years, climate change will become irreversible. We cannot reverse it. So I think it will take time. I think the more than 25 years is required to fight the climate change, but we should start now. And this is the era of youth. Youth can do anything. So I can tell that I come from very suburban area of very not rural area of India. Like I've come from village where we face all this kind of problem. Like I have visited New York. From that background, I can come to that level. So I can everyone in this world have a potential to come. We have great contributor to contribute. Like I really thank to Dr. Johnston, who really shared a good knowledge with us, and Christina and PRME to provide this platform, and Basil to arrange all these things. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your enthusiasm. Be bold, be loud, be clear. Your voice will be heard. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Neer. It's so insightful, and we're very touched by your words. So and now we open the floor for the questions. So please raise your hand or write your question in the chat for Dr. Enji and of course to Neer. Christina and I will be reading out your questions and of course inviting you to the panel.
Basil, there's quite a few questions in the Q&A section of Zoom. We have around 42 questions. The first one that I'm seeing is for Dr. Indy, and it's how could digital technologies like blockchain or satellite MRV improve the credibility of Article 6 mechanisms?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so digital MRV has come up time and time again, not only in reference to Article 6 itself, but equally, again, in general practice on the voluntary carbon market. Digital MRV, including satellites, can be particularly helpful when concerning nature-based projects such as REDD+, which results in reducing deforestation rates, but equally in terms of afforestation, so planting trees and whatnot. And you can use satellites to help measure the growth in trees and their resiliency, and also perhaps in an event such as a wildfire, how much has died back. Interestingly, in that consultation I mentioned that closed just on Monday, the 6.4 supervisory body specifically referenced the potential of satellite technologies to contribute to Article 6. Blockchain is an interesting one, and there has been attempts to develop and utilize blockchain technologies through the carbon crediting kind of framework, particularly the voluntary carbon market. And interestingly, there was an entity called Toucan that had the idea to buy all of the very cheap kind of carbon credits on the market and securely retire them via blockchain. And actually got banned off all the platforms and caused a lot of controversy and whatnot. And so while blockchain is a really good idea, a lot of the incumbent registries really didn't like it because it caused some questions related to the restrictions that they were putting on their platforms. but it could be a really critical tool to help avoid double counting too, and could work in parallel to corresponding adjustments that are available via the Article 6 mechanism. Great question, thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Ng. We also do have another question from Yara. She's asking, how can we ensure that ITMOs reflect actual reduction rather than fictitious ones, especially in the sectors where measurement is difficult, such as agriculture or forestry?
Another great question. And so what's really interesting is that when we think about even the Paris Agreement's kind of architecture beyond this, so all countries have to set nationally determined contributions. They all also have to submit an inventory of their emissions sources and sinks. So in some of the categories, like was mentioned in the question, such as agriculture as well as forestation, it does depend on the accuracy of reporting that is there initially, especially when you start to adjust, say, a corresponding adjustment, which results in a plus to the host country's emissions balance, and then a minus that is transferred over to the buyer countries. And so again, we're very early in how these technologies could be developed as part of this, and especially early in terms of whether or not we're able to do this in a robust way. As I mentioned, the very first technical expert review reports only came out a few months ago. And again, they illustrated real lessons asking for more transparency as to the processes. Because again, Article 6.2 and that whole trading framework of mitigation outcomes really does depend on how effectively and responsibly parties within that system are utilizing the appropriate reporting frameworks and methodologies concerning how those credits were actually generated. We also released just in June Oxford Principles for Article 6 responsible engagement. I have included a link to those in the slides, and so when you receive those, you should be able to find them. But yeah, if you also Google Oxford Article 6 Principles, we've developed 3 key principles that can help ensure that a unit is actually delivering the atmospheric impact that it sets out to do. So that's another source that you could look to for some specific guidance as to what that could entail. Thanks.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Another question is from Vin. How can we ensure transparency and accountability in bilateral carbon trading agreements under Article 6.2, especially when African countries often lack negotiating power or technical capacity?
This is a fantastic question. And actually, for anyone that will be at Africa Climate Summit, my team and I will be there and would love to chat about this further, because one of the key reasons why we feel it's important to go there is because we want to help enable those negotiating from the host country side with some information about how to like properly leverage that system, because there's a real risk here, not only in terms of the transparency aspect, but even in terms of displacing climate finance generally that is otherwise owed under Article 9. So this is a component we haven't yet touched on, as part of this discussion today, just due to time. But we have to also think about the Paris Agreement as an overall package that contains a number of different levers. For instance, results-based financing for nature-based sinks and sources is under Article 5. General climate finance under Article 9. We have provisions related to technological transfer. And there's a real risk right now that, as opposed to these different subsections and levers of the Paris Agreement being utilized how they were designed to, for everything to get channeled through and produce a very conditional form of carbon finance through Article 6.2 and 6.4. And this is because the impact of corresponding adjustments mean that if you sell a unit from your inventory, you have to then additionally make up that effort. Otherwise, you'll have undermined the ambition level of the system. So this also makes it much more difficult for host countries often to achieve their aims and to develop ambitious NDCs. And so we have to also control for that. And again, one of the key ways that could be safeguarded against is really only using Article 6 for the very high-hanging activities. So saying, for instance, if you want to come and finance direct air capture in Kenya, brilliant. But if you're coming in and trying to fund the very the low-hanging fruit in Kenya's NDC as Switzerland, then you're making it actually harder for Kenya to achieve their ambitions. You're also not receiving a robust enough emission decarbonization signal yourself, because you're able to kind of buy a very cheap in comparison credit rather than offset your emissions. And so there's a lot of different, very nuanced implications from how the system is set up. But again, we're very early in the emergence of this as a system. And so many of the loopholes that could come about have not yet been exploited. But unfortunately, because of how the transparency rules work in relation to Article 6.2, it's really up to the parties for when they may disclose certain information. And so, for instance, for this current round of NDCs, we may not get information on how Article 6 is actually being used by countries right up until the deadline just before 2030, which again can present some serious risks for the overall environmental integrity of the system, which is likely why the UN, as you saw when we looked at that COP29 paragraph 54 that came out of the Article 6.2 discussion and negotiation room, where they said, actually, we don't endorse the environmental integrity of the unit. And they put that caveat because of these risks involved. But yeah, fantastic question.
And as a follow-up, there's another question from Fanon. Could you explain why up until 2025, the majority of African countries have not been able to fully benefit from the funds allocated through carbon credits? What are the main barriers or limitations preventing their access to these resources?
Yeah, so this is when it's really interesting when we think about carbon markets as a financing mechanism. And I think, again, we have to really come to the core of it, which is, are they delivering as an efficient financing mechanism? For a long time, they haven't been operating with the transparency that would require of other financial markets. And that's often meant that project developers, as well as brokers, were the ones that were receiving the funds. And oftentimes those funds did not translate down to the local communities. Sometimes those funds did not even fund actual mitigation on the ground. And in fact, were kind of just fraudulent practices. And so there's very few examples of carbon credit projects that have actually very effectively channeled financing to the ground. But this does differ depending on the type of project. And so this, again, is why some projects are better funded as unconditional climate finance that can go just directly to the kind of project and community on the ground, as opposed to a kind of format of carbon credits, because those are very conditional. There is costs involved with going and getting a carbon credit produced. For instance, you have to pay for validation and verification. And, especially if there's a broker involved, they often charge a fee and margin. And so oftentimes, again, we have to think, is this project really going to be most effectively financed through carbon markets, or is there a risk of exploitation by actors within the value chain? And so we've seen a lot of exploitation to date. Some of the Article 6 rules are trying to prevent that, and we're hoping that there will be more and more transparency over time as a result of more and more expectations of transparency and true market efficiencies. Yet this is not guaranteed. And so it's something that we're working very hard to try and encourage as a system, but it's definitely not guaranteed by the rules under Article 6.
Thank you, Dr. Ng. We do also have another question. What systems are in place to avoid double counting when mitigation outcomes are transferred between countries?
Yeah, so the principal way that is applied is through this corresponding adjustment. So this is different to, or why we didn't need corresponding adjustments under the Kyoto Protocol was because it was only kind of 38 or 39 Annex 1 countries, depending on the period, that had direct binding emission reduction commitments. And so unless they were trading under the International Emissions Trading Scheme, then there was not a need to then apply that corresponding adjustment. But now under Article 6 and more broadly the Paris Agreement, with all countries having nationally determined contribution, having a national inventory, there is a need for corresponding adjustments. But what's interesting is corresponding adjustments are not only required between country transfers, they can be required sometimes for transfers from a country to a corporate ledger. One of the clear examples of that is Corsair, as we explored today. So one of the key components or rules in Corsair is no double counting with another country, because this is or reflective of the fact that international aviation is kind of set in a separate bucket to the kind of jurisdictional inventory accounting of the Paris Agreement. So It's there's not just measures now for double counting between countries, but there's also some measures for double counting between countries and certain corporates. And it's also up to a corporate now whether they do obtain a correspondingly adjusted credit just as an extra surety. But the kind of guidance that's emerging, so for instance, the voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, VCMI, and their claims code says that corporates that are following their framework do not have to, but could get a correspondingly adjusted credit. So it's not something that they necessarily are mandated to consider, but they do have the optionality to use that if they so wish. Thanks for the question.
Here, there's a question for you about the Prime Student Sustainability Award. If you can explain a little bit more about it and how much is the award size and what was the process around it?
So it's been a great opportunity to be part of PRME Global Forum. So if you want to go for the submission, so who is first of all I will call who is eligible for this award. Like any institute who's a part of PRME signatory, who's a PRME signatory member is eligible for this award. What exactly you do in a year, every time around Feb, I think Krishna, Feb we open the application now, if I'm not wrong. Yeah. So every Feb the applications are open. If you are a part of a student club and who run a student club in their college or university and are really creating a ground impact, can apply for this award. And every year in the PRME Global Forum, you guys are being awarded. So what you exactly have to do every year in a Feb, you just have to check the PRME website. Every details are available there. You just have to fill the form and submit the application with all the supporting document, what you have done throughout the year and whose life is get impacted from this. According to this, you will compete with the world, and the best entries who are really creating an environmental change, who are really creating a societal change, getting the SDGs are getting awarded for this. And guys, if you are applying for this, it's a really great opportunity. You get a chance to connect the world. You can share your idea in a global forum. Yeah, it's a great opportunity. So if you need any more information, you can pin me on LinkedIn or you can connect with Basil, Christian, or me directly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nir. Christina, if we can also invite some of the participants to our panel. Yeah, sure.
Yes, of course. For anyone that wants to ask a question directly, can you raise your hand and I'll give you the permission to ask it in person. Muntazir, the floor is yours. Can you hear us?
All right. Thank you so much for the opportunity. And I really enjoy the lecture by Dr. Johnston. My question is about the carbon border adjustment mechanism. I want to know how justifiable it is under the Paris Agreement, given the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. Because my understanding of it is that it puts pressure on the flow of trade from global South countries, because perhaps they have lesser regulations on carbon emission. And so the product they supply to the EU being maybe subjected to taxation because they are coming from carbon intensive countries. So I want to now relate it with the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, whether it is justifiable, whether it is a cause for African countries to renegotiate such kind of policies in the EU. That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Montasar. And it's a fantastic question because, again, it illustrates that, these trends in carbon pricing are complex and can have a number of consequences and can really cause a lot of harm if they're not carefully designed and implemented as part of a package. So this question in relation to the carbon border adjustment mechanism is a really good one, and it's really interesting because as you look back to how that was negotiated within the EU, this question of exemptions for certain countries came up time and time and again, principally because of exactly how you raised this notion and understanding of the importance of common but differentiated responsibilities. Yet it's interesting when we consider also that the innovation and shift from the Kyoto Protocol to the Paris Agreement, we now not only have common but differentiated responsibilities, but respective capabilities. And what's really interesting here with this kind of carbon border adjustment mechanism dynamic is that that is in part one of the reasons why we're seeing a growth in carbon pricing regimes, because it incentivizes countries affected by the carbon border adjustment mechanism to actually set up their own schemes so that they can claim that revenue to help fund their mitigation, as opposed to having to enable their exporters to obtain these EU CBAM certificates and thereby contributing to the budget and revenue of the EU. Still, I think we're very early in exploring and putting political pressure on the EU to ensure that funds generated through the CBAM actually are returned back to the countries that may not have a carbon pricing mechanism themselves, but are interested in and want to still develop and need to access that revenue to fund decarbonization. And again, this is why it's critical that any conversation we have around carbon markets and carbon pricing, we also have to bring up the advent of the newly quantified goal of climate finance, 1.3 trillion. Again, this is an innovation out of COP29, and it's something that we have to hold every developed country to actually ensuring that they are delivering on their obligations. And so that's why it's critical that we really encourage any conversation of Article 6 to be paired with Article 9 and ensuring that Article 9 is being enforced and the promises within that are upheld. Because, otherwise there can be very inequitable outcomes, not just from carbon border adjustment mechanisms, but even the impact of these corresponding adjustments. Because some of the first trades we have seen are where countries such as Switzerland and Singapore do come in and purchase the kind of low-hanging fruit within an NDC, which is only making it harder for that host country to achieve their mitigation outcomes themselves. And so, fantastic question, and it's something that I think we'll see a lot more attention paid to in coming years.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
And again, we'll be out at the Africa Climate Summit for anyone attending. We'd love to connect. I'm very happy to talk through these issues further, and we'll be doing some training then. And we also have we've started running a masterclass in international carbon markets, which is accessible if you're working for a government or kind of third-party NGO. And we'll be running the next course of that in January. So you're also very welcome to keep an eye out on our page for registrations for that when that opens, because that will provide a much more in-depth training than what I was able to cover in today's 80 minutes, but will again cover off some of those mechanisms as well and provide a bit more context.
Okay, thank you. Please, what did you say again as the name of the opportunity so that I can note it?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's the Masterclass in International Carbon Markets. And so it's run by the Public and Third Sector Academy that we have here at Oxford. So if you Google that, unfortunately, I can't paste links into the chat, but if you Google that, it should be able to come up. Thanks.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Enji. Also, we do have another question. So if we could also invite him, Christina, to the panel. It's from Sehidul Islam.
Hi, Sahidul. Can you hear us?
Hello,
Mhm.
Assalamu alaikum. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, it's Shahidul Islam from Chittagong, Bangladesh. It's honored to be here. I want to ask, how can carbon market mechanism under Article 6 be designed to protect the interest of a vulnerable country like Bangladesh? Can I repeat?
Oh, no, that's wonderful. Yeah, no, I got that question loud and clear. So in several ways, the rules have tried to integrate some provisions and protections. And so, for instance, that share of proceeds for the adaptation fund that I mentioned under Article 6.4, there is an exemption for least developed countries as well as small island developing states. And so there are some ways that the rules have tried to provide a little bit of a carve out. However, again, I think it's not just about the Article 6 rules, but the Article 6 rules as part of that broader Paris Agreement package. And I think, again, the devil will be in the detail about whether or not states are delivering on their climate finance commitments, as well as exploring these Article 6 opportunities for collaboration. And again, ensuring that within a country also, that the benefits of carbon market financing are actually returned to that community. And again, this has not happened so much in the first generation of carbon markets. It was a bit of a Wild West, but we know a lot more now. And so that's why we're seeing some very strong national provisions come up in a number of countries. The UNEP CCC database that I've provided a link for in the PowerPoint, and you'll receive also details a number of national frameworks and laws, and we'll be providing and releasing a roadmap to net zero aligned carbon market regulation, which will also include specific recommendations for different ranges of countries. And so again, there'll be some tips and tricks for how a national jurisdiction could approach this in order to safeguard some of these things. But again, it comes down to not only having kind of a strong domestic regime, but equally in terms of making sure at the negotiation level that particularly when negotiating with a potential buyer country, that Article 9 obligations, Article 5 results-based financing is also on the table, because these can offer a lot more unconditional forms of climate financing that can much more directly benefit particularly LDCs and SIDS. Great question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to meet you.
We have time for 2 more questions. Olusola, the floor is yours. Let me know if you hear us.
Hello.
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 We can hear you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Johnston. You have done justice to that topic, and I listened with rapt attention. However, there's a little question I actually want to ask. As a lecturer in a higher institution, I just want to ask, what role can a mathematician play in this issue of carbon market or carbon emission? What role can a mathematician play? I just want to, that's just my question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Amasola. I mean, really interesting question. I think, whatever skills that you have, whether mathematician or other, there's always going to be a way to contribute to these kinds of projects and the delivery on the ground, because these are very complex and multifaceted projects. So one key way, an issue that we've seen develop in the past is over quantification of, potential emissions reductions. And so oftentimes that can be as simple as just actually simply people not doing the math correctly or formatting Excel sheets incorrectly and summing up things wrong. So, there's definitely, as a mathematician, obviously you're much more used to doing much more complex figures, but actually in the carbon market generally, we know there's been a need for much more simple maths equations. And so there could be a role, for instance, in supporting project developers to ensure that they are in fact doing their numbers correctly on the back end. That would be the most kind of direct application I would see. But again, also there's instances related to how different greenhouse gases are converted, because that becomes a numerical equation too. So there are different ways in which mathematical skills could be applied in this domain.
Okay, thank you for that. But if there's any opportunity like that, I would like to know, because I'm really interested, and as a mathematician, I'm seeing how we can apply this. If there's any opportunity in that regard, please, I would like to to partner with you in that regard. Thank you.
One final question. Abdul, the floor is yours. Can you hear us?
Hello, Assalamu alaikum. My name is Abdul Karim Gill, and I'm from Islamic Republic, Pakistan. Currently, I'm doing PhD in Environmental Sciences. I have the question, Dr. Johnston. Is there any mechanism or principle in all legislation and all bilateral or trilateral agreement? Did we place those who are really, I didn't say the culprit, I say that who are the responsible for increasing the temperature from pre-industrial era to current state, okay? And second, did there any mechanism or gauge a system that can gauge the who is basic emitter? If I'm just giving the example, Pakistan and India are border, and especially in winter season, Lahore, the capital of Punjab, and India, New Delhi, both are facing a bad, huge fog. Okay, that due to both country blaming to each other, like you burn your field, especially paddy field, and the ash of the paddy field, and smoke and wet all is uh, when combined that become the fog. But we didn't gauge, we didn't calculate who did that, who actually really producing it. Is there, because we can't stop the air to crossing the border. Likewise, carbon or air has no passport, no visa. They are freely moved as per wind direction. Thank you very much.
Yeah, fantastic question. And so to answer your second one very quickly first, we are seeing more and more satellite technologies being deployed to investigate point source emissions such as this. And, in fact, the history of international environmental law goes right back to what was called the Trail Smelter case, which was an instance where on the Canadian and US border, a very similar event had happened. And there was, that was the birth of international environmental law, because these cross-border pollution issues are a matter of great concern. So there are technologies now that are increasingly looking at that. And to your first question about really unpacking who it is generating these emissions, who has responsibility for them, there are a number of different frameworks being proposed. One that's come out of the University of Oxford is this idea of a carbon removal take-back obligation. So this obligation on fossil fuel producers to take back the carbon that they're emitting and geologically store it again. I think more and more as we see, tensions within countries, we will start to see a greater focus on sectors and the sectors that are mostly intensely emitting, and again, measures to address that. We've seen that a little bit with just energy transition partnerships and efforts to phase down coal and to ramp up renewable energy deployment. But I think we're really, that we will see that more and more. Fantastic question. Thank you.
Isn't it will when we talking about the climate and ultimately we sanctioning someone state, because if we're talking about then is to go back to the 100 years back in 1925, the League of Nations was failed just because of the member state are disobeying. Okay, and now if that time there are multi powers, multi superpowers, and then there's a buy and then try, and now again every continent has own champion, and every continent and every country including himself is champion. Okay, when developed state like EU, US, they're making such law and they're putting pressure like in a non-developing state like Africa, like Asia. If you're talking about the Pakistan, India are not developing state. We are using a cheapest source of energy, like we are burning our carbon. We're burning carbon to get energy to run our industry, because carbon is sufficiently available. So when EU and US sanction on us, like African country or Asian countries, ultimately that isn't lead toward the conflict or isn't lead toward the failure like League of Nations.
So there's a couple of things there. What's really interesting, and I have a colleague, Dr. Suganda, who actually works on power contracts in Pakistan, and actually Renewables are the cheaper form of energy access there, but unfortunately, there's these long-term agreements that have been entered into, which are really a bad deal economically, but also for the climate. And so there's pressure to renegotiate some of those contracts in order to be able to unlock true energy access and efficiency. But again, these issues are related to who has the historical carbon debt, which is definitely the global north, and some areas of ongoing emissions, are exactly why Advent through like carbon pricing and through Article 6 kind of came about. But again, in that instance, rather than sanctions, it should be economic support to transition. I mentioned those just energy transition partnerships. They've been one model for that, but again, there's still real issues ensuring that that financing is grant-based as opposed to loan-based, because as we know, there's also been a huge history of concessional financing and debt restructuring and structural adjustment that has caused a lot of issues and has, so I think when we're talking about this issue, we also need to be thinking about, debt for climate swaps, debt for nature swaps, and these kinds of other ways to ease the financial burden that has in large part also just been caused by the global north to enable more fiscal space and options for the global south to achieve mitigation in an equitable way. Thanks for the question.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Enji, and thank you, Abdul, for your question. So unfortunately, we're out of time. So we wanted to really thank you, Dr. Enji and Nir, for joining us today and for your time. We're truly grateful for it. And of course, to Ms. Christina for all the support that we're having. So our next session will be with Dr. Jennifer. Dr. Jennifer Turlik from MIT, focusing on harnessing artificial intelligence for climate solutions. So please make sure that you have joined us on the WhatsApp group to have the reminders and also the Zoom links. And thank you again, and see you next time, inshallah.
Thank you. It was a privilege to connect with you tonight, and
Thank you, everyone.
wishing you all the best for the rest of the program. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely evening. Bye.